study through the New Testament. We do here on Thursdays. Currently, we are in the book of Matthew, and we make it to the 12th chapter today. There are two things at the front end of this passage. It's dealing with some things that happen on the Sabbath. And it's something that you'll find in the Gospels that's addressed quite often. And there were always, I shouldn't say always, there are a number of places where things that Jesus did raised a lot of alarm and concern among the religious types. And this is two of the examples, though you can find them throughout the Gospels. They tried to find ways to make accusations against Jesus based on what he did on the Sabbath. So we're going to get to the first two of those that we'll see in Matthew, this being in chapter 12. First time that it's come up as a major topic as far as what he did on a particular Sabbath. And you're probably familiar with them. They're pretty interesting, and so we'll get to those here in just a moment. Two very brief things. The apologetics that we do. The topics that I choose are ones that just come up in conversation. And actually, this is one that just came as I was looking at it. Hopefully, I'll remember to say this at the end. It came up just because I was sitting in the congregation on a Sunday morning, which is different for me now being out here in Texas. But I get a chance to just listen to what's being taught and studied, and I thought this would make for an interesting topic. I've dealt with this when we went through the book of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs recently, and I will bring it up again as far as Solomon is concerned and what he had as far as his life was concerned, the kind of compromise that came in, and the problems that it ended up causing for him. So I want to look at that and do it as a topic to show the problems that we have as far as compromise is concerned when it comes to matters of faith, things that we know that we're supposed to do, and yet we choose to do otherwise. So we're going to take a look at that and use Solomon as a great example of it because you can see how it worked out in his life. So we will do that at the end, and I want to make an announcement again. So we're getting really close. The trip to Israel, we're still supposed to report all the registrations within about a week of today. But probably most important about it is if you would like to go on the trip, I can even make provision past next week, so long as I know and I can vouch for you, I guess you could say, with the travel agency that we use or the travel company that we use there in Israel. But let me just say, we have a small group that's going this time. It's kind of the way that I like it, mainly because it gives us a chance to see everything that's in our itinerary. We have a busy trip, and so we see a lot of locations, more than most groups. And there's a reason behind that. That's why we design them the way that we do. Again, it's not something that is put together for us. This is an itinerary of my choosing. And because of that, I don't want to just go when everybody else is there. Makes it very difficult for us to see everything. Now, you may have heard me say this before, but let me just make sure I'm really clear on this. We are not going to be doing another trip this year because the fall is going to be very busy, and that will carry into 2027. So I won't be doing one this year again, and I won't be doing another one next year. So for the next 2 years at the earliest, I will not be taking a trip back to Israel. I won't be taking a group there. So if you have the ability to go and you might be thinking of some reason, you're on the fence about the whole thing and you want to go, 2 years is a very long time in this world, especially with the way that things are going. This is a kind of a trip that you never regret going. It changes the way that you study the scriptures. So, and really understand your whole walk as a believer by getting a chance to see where these things took place. So I would love to have you along with us, but time is very short for us to get you in and registered and keeping the airline fees down. They're lower than I would have expected. So they're actually very reasonable right now. So if you are having any interest in this, you need to get in touch with me right away. I'd love to have you come with me. If you know somebody who would like to go, maybe you're not able to, but you know somebody who might want to, put them in touch with me. Again, it's easy to get on with a big group, but with big groups come bigger problems and a much shorter itinerary because you can't get dozens or even hundreds of people from every location to where they're supposed to go and really spend the kind of time that you want. Those are just way too busy. So I do very, very small groups. This is definitely in my estimation, is the much better way to go. Even if I could take hundreds of people, I really wouldn't do it. I cap my tours at much, much smaller numbers. So anyhow, we have that going on. It's going to be leaving on April the 20th of this year, so a couple of months down the road. And again, there's still time to get everything. Even if you need a passport, you still have time to get that. But I need to hear from you as soon as possible. For everything we do on this program and on this channel, you can contact me through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And there's an email there. You can ask me any questions that you might have, and you can contact me if you have questions about the Israel trip. Definitely want to try to get the information to you as soon as possible. Now, Matthew 12. Interesting passage, and it's easy to misunderstand what Jesus ends up doing here, and it gives the impression that Jesus is able to say he can violate the law. Now, we've already looked earlier in this chapter, in this book, where people have made the observations that Jesus was violating the law by him saying back in chapter 5, 6, somewhere thereabouts, where there was a series of them, but he says that you have heard it said, but I say to you. So it wasn't that he was contradicting what's in the law. He contradicted what was in their traditions. And oftentimes we'll hear people talk about the Talmud and the things that are found in the Talmud. And basically that's commentary for the most part. And it's all the regulatory things that the religious leaders have passed down through the millennia that Jews have to observe. And so that's what we're going to be seeing discussed here when Jesus talks about this, as far as what the Bible would have prohibited versus what they had prohibited by their traditions. And it's really important that we understand that, because traditions, even in our day, depending on what church you might go to, there may be things that I don't care if you do communion on a particular day. I don't care if you turn your lights down during worship. That's not tradition. That's just what you do as far as your church is concerned. But tradition would be the things, here's what we believe because this has been passed down from generation to generation through our church, and it really becomes more of an issue of what's taught and what's believed. Those are the considerations. That's what's wrong, and that's what's creating the problem. So if your tradition is how you do a particular thing and the aesthetic of your church, or it's customary, this is how we've always done it around here, that's one thing. But what you do as far as instruction is concerned, if it's done because it's been done that way for so long and this is what we've always taught, but you never match it up against the scriptures, that becomes the problem. And that's what Jesus corrects here. And so we're going to take a look at that. I find it to be a fascinating thing that Jesus does. There are two instances here. The first one is verses 1 to 8, and it is Jesus where he is giving them instruction. He is teaching them something. So it's not a miracle that he has done. It's an observation that's made by what are his religious opponents about his disciples. And this isn't the first time, because he's going to basically say to them something that has been said to them before, and it's that they're misappropriating even what the law, or what the prophet would have to say. Hosea, when he talks about you guys have, there's no grace, there's no mercy in you people at all. Everything is according to the letter of things. So there was a problem with that. This is now the second time that he's going to use the same verse that's in mind, and he quotes it directly. And it's an indictment against them. So same guys, different reason. This is during the Sabbath. Now the second one is where he heals on the Sabbath. So he does a physical, actual work, something that is miraculous, and it is done on the Sabbath. So once again, because their tradition says you can't do whatever on the Sabbath, it's all stuff that they've added on to it. Now you will know that God had said that the Sabbath is to be the day of rest. It's the day where man ceases from his labor and turns his attention towards the Lord. And there are things that he says, you're not to do any work. You're not to do things. This is something that has been put aside for you to rest from your labor for the day and have your focus on the Lord. Well, the problem that they ran into is that they had literally added chapters of commentary and basically saying you can do this and you can't do that on the Sabbath, stuff that's well outside of the Bible, but it's all the traditions that man loves to heap on top because the Bible might say something, and even by implication, they say it must mean this, and they add in all these layers. And so by the time that it's done, nobody questions it, and it's treated as though it's actually what's in the scripture, and here Jesus is going to correct it. He's just going to stomp right through the middle of the whole thing and just say, no, it's going to be this way. Now, we are going to take a look at the other, on the second part of this, we will look at what is said in the other two Gospels. There are only a couple of very, very minimal additions in Mark and Luke on the first of these two things, verses 1 to 8. And I'll just make mention of those so that we're not going directly to them. So let's turn to Matthew 12 and let's have a word of prayer, and we'll take a look at the text. Father, we thank you once again for the privilege that it is to sit at your feet and to take in those things that you would teach us. And what would we be able to take away from this? How can we learn from this? We're not people who are under the law and not having things dictated to us by people who are. But are there things here that we can learn? And so we pray that you would help us in application to learn what your word has to say to us and why these things should matter. So we give you all thanks, and we pray that you would open our eyes to your word, and by the work of the Holy Spirit, that we would be in a place of understanding and a place of excitement, and that we would follow you with complete abandon, with no compromise. We give you thanks and all praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so let's read the first 8 verses. This will be the first of the two things that took place. Now it says, and it says, at that time, and let's remember that there is something that has just taken place where Jesus has talked about taking his yoke upon them, and that his yoke is easy, his burden is light. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That was the close of chapter 11. So in the thought and in the mind of maybe Matthew as he's writing this is the next subject that he brings up. And Jesus has talked about the idea of rest. And interesting that the very next thing that's brought to us is something that is dealing with the traditional Jewish day of rest, and they had turned it into anything but. And they had found all kinds of little provisos and ways to get around things. And, well, this is a work if you walk this many steps, but if you make your household this big, you can add steps to that. The absurdity of it is just ridiculous. Now, interestingly enough, this is something that we see in Israel. And we have to tell the people who have never been there before, be very careful of this on Friday night. And it's pretty easy. You can tell when you get to the hotels which one it is. But there is what they would call a Sabbath elevator. And so if you're at a hotel that has multiple floors, you have to go in the elevator. But for them, pressing the button, if we're staying on floor number 5, we've got to press that button number 5. That's work to them. So they have a switch, a control on one of the banks of the elevators that it stops at every single floor. Stops at floor 1, 2, all the way up to the top, and it stops at every floor coming down so that the people only need to walk onto the elevator, but they don't press a button. That's the absurdity of it. It's become that so stuck into the detail that there's nothing that would give any indication. So that's obviously much more modern. There weren't elevators obviously back then. That's modern. That's what has been put on because man puts on all of these traditions and commentary, if you will, on the scriptures, but there's no real reason to believe it. But it's said by the rabbi, and it's passed on, and it's passed on, and it becomes law. So that's the kind of stuff that he's fighting here 2,000 years ago. So let's read the verses here. It says, now at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Now, interesting. According to the different traditions and whatnot, the idea of if you walked too far of a distance, you would be in violation of the law. And at this point, you have not only those who would believe in him that wanted to hear what he had to say, the disciples that are with him, you have his adversaries following him. So, obviously they wouldn't they wouldn't have brought an accusation against him, you're walking too far on the Sabbath, because they were walking with him. They're looking for an excuse, and we see that in the text here. So, of course, Jesus is going to use this as an opportunity to have some things to say to them. And so this is what they observe. Now, just again, they're walking through and there's grain fields close to it. So their disciples are reaching out their hands and they're plucking the grain. And Luke's gospel, that's the one that's a little bit different, is it says that they were grinding them in their hands, which was separating the husk on the outside of it, and it was making it so that what was left was just the kernel, something that they could actually eat, the grain. So you want to get the husk off of it. So if you think about what would happen if you're thinking about traditionally what we've read in the Bible about a threshing floor, if you're doing this with larger volumes, you're going to put it up on the peak of some kind of a hill and wait for the winds, and you would throw it up into the air, and the wind would blow off the chaff, and what would remain is just the grain. So in their minds, it's no different than those people who during the other days of the week, other than that sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, that they would be any other day of the week, if that's what they did, they would be taking large amounts of this grain, they would be throwing it up in the air and doing the whole thing of works. Well, for the disciples, again, Luke's gospel records this, chapter 6, they were just doing this, rubbing it in their hands, which was separating the grain from the chaff, and they probably could just blow on it, and that would get rid of any of the stuff that they didn't want to be consuming. So they're doing this, not thinking anything of it, but of course there's a matter of hunger that's going on here. So they're hungry and they're eating, they're doing this. Now, the Pharisees, the people who are, ones enforcing all of the tradition, are up in arms about this, and they want to make it an incident. Now, let's remember, these guys are not following Jesus because they're devoted to him. They're following him around, and in this case, we know that they're looking for something that could be an offense as far as him, and he's doing something to violate the law of God, something that he's doing in violation of what God would want him to do. That's the backdrop for what we see here. So verse 3 says this, "But Jesus said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and he and those who were with him?'" This is taken from 1 Samuel chapter 21. And that's where you can read it if you want to go back and check it. "And how he entered the house of God, and he ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests." He asks this question. So this is a great apologetic thing, and you've heard me mention it before. We see Jesus do it all the time. A question is asked of him, and he puts it back on them in the form of a question. Now, this question that he asks them back in rebuttal to this really would put them back on their heels, because the point would be, if you're going to say what my disciples have done in violating your traditions, where were you as far as your critique if David, now they weren't alive at David's time, but David went in and did something that wasn't supposed to be, quote, lawful for him, but God allowed it, and so did the high priest. So, and it had horrible consequence, by the way, because David wasn't even honest. When you read that whole thing, he was saying that he's on a mission from the king. Saul, in this case, he's actually escaping Saul. So he doesn't tell the truth to Abiathar, the high priest, and what he ends up getting is the bread that he requests. Now, the showbread was something that would be put out every Sabbath, and when they would replace the loaves, the ones that were taken out from in front of the altar would then be consumed by the priests. So it was there for them. Now, that's what the scriptures say. It was a provision for the priests. And the priests would actually be eating some of the sacrifices, but it was given to them. So there are some that would say, absolutely, it's unlike. Remember when Uzzah, the man reached out to steady the Ark of the Covenant that was on the back of the cart. Nobody was supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant, but it jostled, and he wanted to save it from falling, and he grabbed and reached out for it, and he died on the spot. So that was a hard, fast thing that God said, no one is to touch the ark. This is the way that it's supposed to be handled and carried. Never should have been on a cart. The Levites should have been holding it on poles and walking with it. That's how it was supposed to be done. This was completely out of order, and the problem was that God was not going to let them play fast and loose. And it seems like a hard, kind of a cruel thing, but God would look to David and say he could, you shouldn't have brought the ark up this way. There's a way that it's supposed to be done, which would let us know that when they actually consume this bread, again, 1 Samuel chapter 21, that as far as those men, they didn't die because they ate the bread. So that would tell you it's a little bit of a different thing. It's the priest's provision. So it was supposed to be consumed by the priest, but God would allow it, in this case, that it could go to David and to his men, even though it was done under false pretense, which is an interesting thing. And again, God is able to do what he does. But once again, there's no such thing as if you eat the showbread and you're not a priest, you're going to die. There was not that kind of a thing. This was more their provision, and God allowed that provision to be shared because of that circumstance. It was unusual, but it was accepted. It had to have been accepted by the Pharisees too, and that's why Jesus uses it as the example. Hey, you didn't seem to have a problem with this. Nobody ever had a problem with this when David did it. And that was actually something that was specified in the law. There's nothing in the law that says if you're walking through a grain field on the Sabbath, you cannot pluck the pieces of grain and eat any of it. That would have been something that if it was a prohibition that was actually in the text, great. That was not the case here. It was a prohibition that was put into their tradition against the law. So here's what we see in verse 4, how David entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to do. It was not acceptable. It's not what was in the law, nor were those who were with him, but only for the priest. So he says, or have you not read that in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple, they profane the Sabbath, and yet they are blameless? So he asks them, look, if this is about work, as you guys think the idea of work, do you have a problem when the priests are doing the work that they're doing on the Sabbath? Because there's offerings and there's everything that's going on during the Sabbath. So they're going through their normal routine of things on the Sabbath when everybody else is supposed to rest. So he basically asks them a question, which really leads to one conclusion, that God will make provision for things that you might think are so incredibly rigid, but you have to use your common sense and realize, well, there are times that it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone in a uniformed way, because it clearly doesn't apply to the Levites and the priests who are doing the work of the temple on the Sabbath. You guys can't violate it, but they can do what God asks them to do and makes provision for them to do the work that they do on the Sabbath. Jesus asks the question, how come you guys aren't, he doesn't say it this way, this is the implication. Are you down there complaining at the temple every Sabbath that the priests are in there doing works on the Sabbath? He's basically calling them out on their silly hypocrisy. But such is the traditions of man, whether it be Jewish, of the time, and really even to modern times, or even among groups that are in the Christian church that have their traditions, and the traditions hold the same weight in the minds of many as the actual scripture itself. So traditions are so unimportant as far as I'm concerned when it comes to, well, that's what our church teaches and that's what we've always done. Yeah, but if I can show you something in the scripture that seems to say otherwise, what would I want to do with your traditions when the scripture says one thing and you say another? Who should win that battle? So here, basically, Jesus says the same thing. The scripture says rest on the Sabbath, but somebody's got to do the offerings, and God has put those people in place to do it. So is God contradictory? Or is he saying, I'm giving it to you as rest, but the priests have their functions and they're going to need to do that on that particular day? Clearly, that's a provision made for the priests. So God makes provision. That's the upshot of this whole thing. And it really answers the arguments that they're making. So he says in verse, 5, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple, they profane, or they do what would otherwise be seen as a profaning thing, as a rejecting of the law, when they do what they do on the Sabbath, but yet God sees them as blameless. So there's obvious reasons why that is. Somebody has to be around to make the offerings, and yet God says no work on the Sabbath. Clearly that's a provision that's made. So in verse 6, now this is where it gets really interesting, and pay very close attention to what you see here, because he's still doing this in the way of correcting them, and he's giving instruction, and he's bringing clarity to what God's original intent is, as opposed to the perversion that they had created. And again, he's done this already in this gospel. We've looked at it. You have heard it said, but I say to you, when it came to murder and adultery and a number of other things, you have heard it said, but I say to you. That you've heard it said is their tradition. What he teaches is biblically accurate according to the law. Same thing here. But he's going to take this a step further. And for those people that we talk to all the time who say Jesus never claimed to be God, there are so many places that I could take you to that it's obvious what he's making as far as his statement. And the two parts that you can take from that is that if he doesn't say it in the actual verbiage that they want, they somehow just ignore everywhere else that he has said things that make it clear who he is and what he's claiming. And this is one of those places. Does Jesus need to say, I am God? Well, he said as much that before Abraham was, I am. That's basically saying the same thing, but it's in language that they don't want to hear. So they somehow think Jesus never claimed to be God. Look at what he says here, because the assertion of this is that Lord liar lunatic. If you've never heard that argument, you look at the things that Jesus says, and you have to come to one of three conclusions. He is who he says he is. He's either that, or he's a deceiver, a liar, or he's just crazy, making all kinds of absurd statements that really, because he's out of his mind. Those are your options. And here's one of those places that the Lord liar lunatic fits. Because he says this, yet, here's what Jesus says. Now again, they're thinking the temple, because he's already pointed out the temple when David ate the showbread, and that was, by that time, they didn't take it out of the holy place. It had just been cycled out from the Sabbath, making it something that could be eaten. So remember again, it came in every Sabbath. Bread was baked. It was put in 2 columns of 6 for 12 loaves that represented the tribes. Each one of the tribes. And interestingly enough, this is such an interesting thing that God would want a loaf of bread put on the table before him, something as an observance that the people would do, when the idea of bread is such an important matter, especially when we think of Jesus and all of the symbology that you see in the temple and in the tabernacle in the wilderness, which is what would have been in David's time. The tabernacle that would have been there, that there are glimpses and types all throughout the tabernacle and into the temple, and one of them was the showbread and how it was provided, and how God would make provision for it. But when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, so yeah, bread was a sustenance kind of a thing, and yet Jesus says, I'm the one that gives sustaining life, and come to me, you who thirst and hunger, and you'll never hunger or thirst again. Just interesting imagery that's here, though it was hidden from them, and he's not doing the bread of life dialogue yet. That's in chapter 6 of John. So here he says, yet I say to you, in this place there is one who is greater than the temple. Again, they're thinking temple. Look at what the priests do every Sabbath. Look at what David did out of necessity way back when, and he came in and ate the showbread. So here Jesus says, there's one who's greater than all of that. Greater than David, greater than the tabernacle, greater than the temple, greater than all things. And he says this of himself, there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And that desiring mercy over sacrifice is taken from Hosea 6, verse 6. So here's the point that he's getting to them. You are so locked into your traditions. You're so confirmed in your own mind that what you do is accurate and godly in the way that it's supposed to be and what God exactly wants. You can't even see that you violate that which God wants, which is mercy. So here, this is the same thing that he has done. He quoted this again when the accusation came against him, that he sat with sinners and tax collectors, if you remember that. So that's back in chapter 6. But they make this accusation against him. It's not chapter 6. I didn't write down the reference, or did I? I did not write it down. It'd be easy to find. Anyway, it's when he's sitting with the tax collectors, and the people are looking at that and saying to the disciples, your teacher, he sits with sinners and tax collectors. And basically it's like, what is he doing hanging around with those ungodly people? And Jesus knows what's going on and challenges them on that. Basically, and I'll paraphrase it, but his point is, look, you guys think that you've got yourselves all figured out and you're religious and you don't need anything. So I'm here to minister to the people that have need that you don't think that you have, though you do, but you don't think that you have it. I'll go to the ones who do know that they have it, and I will minister to them. And he says, have you not read? Don't you understand what God meant in Hosea? That he desires mercy over sacrifice. And he says a similar thing when it's Samuel, when Samuel has to confront Saul. 1 Samuel 15, I believe. It's when Saul was supposed to attack the Amalekites and wipe them all out. Don't even take their livestock. Don't take any kind of plunder. Wipe them out entirely. God knows what they're going to do down the road. He wants them gone. They're in rebellion against him. They're just part of the group that needs to be rid. The land needs to be rid of them, like it should have been when they first came in with Joshua. Well, here we are hundreds of years later, and Saul's the king, and God gives him a directive. Take out the Amalekites. Samuel comes to see him, and he hears the animals that have been taken as plunder, and he finds out that the king Agag has been kept. And Samuel says to him, "What is this? What am I hearing?" And then Saul makes the excuse. Well, this is what the guys took, but we brought back the king, and all this other stuff. And Samuel says, "It's not what God told you to do." And he tells him that the kingdom's ripped from you. You can't even find your way to be obedient to what God says. And he says, God prefers obedience over sacrifice. So all the animals that you brought and all the things that you think that you're doing in your religious, observance, why didn't you just do what God told you in the first place? Then there'd be no reason for this problem that's come up. Just be obedient. That's all that you needed to do, and you couldn't bring yourself to do it. So interesting that the same thing here. Now, Jesus says to them, again, I had said, what Jesus asserts here is something that only God could assert. Who could be greater than the place that God's presence would be and where the people would have to come to make offering and sacrifice? Now, remember, by this time, when David did that, when he went into the temple at the time that he did that, or at the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant was still there. Everything was exactly like it's supposed to be. Though by the time Jesus' time had come around, the ark is not there. It's a different kind of a thing. They're under the Romans. They're not free to practice as they want to. So it's a much different thing, yet they still go through the motions and they still do the things in the temple. So his point is, you guys, whether it's David or the modern day priests who are doing the things in the temple, and that's the place of the corporate worship, and that's all the rest, he says there is one among you who is greater than all of the religious observance that you have, even to the point of the focal point of all of their religious instruction and all of their religious observance, the very temple itself in Jerusalem. Jesus asserts himself as being greater than all of it, and all of it was put in place because God had directed it. So Jesus, to be able to say of himself, I'm greater than the very same place that God had given to you as the place of corporate worship for the children of Israel. I'm greater than that. Now, that is if you're looking to make a headline among these people, instead of him saying, you know what, you're right, they violated, they shouldn't have done what they did, that's a breaking of your traditions, so we're sorry. And then instead what they've done to him is that, are you not paying attention to what your disciples are doing? They're incredulous. Look at what your disciples are doing. And instead of Jesus saying, I wasn't paying attention, now he knows exactly what they're doing. And now he confronts them on their hypocrisy and the fact that they lean on their tradition more so than even the law of God. They had so corrupted it and added so much to it. They had stripped it of its original meaning entirely. And they had made it just a construct of man, which is the way that churches do with tradition. This is what tradition causes, unfortunately. It's just no different. So, interestingly enough, he says this, and he says, and so what I've done, and what you should have been able to do, is say, these men are genuinely hungry. They're not bored. They're genuinely hungry. And so that would be what God would see. It's a merciful thing. God allows a provision, even among your traditions, you should make allowance for this. God made allowance for something in the law, and that was that David and his men had great need that day, and God allowed them to have the bread, and it didn't cost them. So they were able to do that, and it wasn't seen as a violation. Here, these guys are only doing what's against your traditions, not something in the law, and you want to make an issue of it? So he says, let me assert my authority here. I'm greater than the temple and all the things that you see in your religious tradition. You don't even understand what God says. I would much rather people be merciful and compassionate than to follow the absolute, what they think is the letter, that God is not holding man to. You guys are holding men to this. It's amazing. So he ends up saying this in verse 8, which is even greater. It's an even heavier thing. For the Son of Man is the Lord, even of the Sabbath. And it's in Mark's gospel, the parallel to this. And let me give you the places you can get this. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, and Luke chapter 6. I'm sorry, wrong ones. It's Mark chapter 2, rather, verses 23 to 28, and Luke chapter 6, verses 1 to 5. If you read both of those, and on the second part of what we're going to go through, the second of the things that took place, we will look at those other ones. But these other two here, the first one that we're doing, looking at the other Gospels, there's really not a lot there. Other than Luke said that they rubbed it in their hands, which was separating the wheat from the chaff. In Mark's, the one thing that you find that's a little bit different is that Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So it's like, well, what was it supposed to do? Man doesn't serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath is supposed to serve him, gives him rest, gives him the ability to be with his family, gives him the ability to turn his focus to the Lord. And it's an interesting thing because, again, our trips to Israel, we've made friendships with some of the people who live there, and especially the sometimes talking with the tour guides, but with the owners of the tour agency that we use. And Sabbath is a big thing as far as the families are concerned. Even among the secular, it's the time when they get together and they have it just with the family. They have a big meal. Everybody comes over. It's a big time for the family to get together and just enjoy being around one another. It's a big, big tradition. Even if you don't observe it from the religious point of view, it's still something that's just inculcated throughout the entirety of their culture. It's a family thing. And that's what God intended it to be, but with the other element too, that the family is gathered together in their worship of God. That's what should be the case. So that should be the rest that they have. They cease from their labor for a day. They don't concern themselves with the day-to-day of things here. They concern themselves with more of the eternal, their focus on the Lord. It just changed over time. And it's an easy thing to see because man's way of things is just kind of compromised. It's how we're wired to do it. So look at what Jesus says again. For the Son of Man is the Lord, the Kyrios, even over the Sabbath. So, man, think about this. The Sabbath was one of the 10 commandments. I mean, that's a big deal. So for Jesus to be able to say, I'm not subject to the Sabbath, I have rule over the very Sabbath itself. Imagine the hearing that if you're the people who are bringing this accusation against him. Not only does he not apologize, not only does he try to not make an excuse for it, he takes them head on by saying, you guys are upset because they violated your traditions. You're the same guys that don't have a problem when the priests would be, according to the most strict, understanding of the verbiage in the law, they're violating it every single Sabbath. And David would have been violating what we know because he ate the showbread. Even after it was taken off the table and it had been changed out, it was given as provision for the Levites. But God allowed it, and David was able to eat a portion of what was given to the Levites. So his point is, if you don't have a problem with any of that stuff, then you really need to stop with your problems that you're bringing to my attention about my disciples. You guys want to show judgment against those that God calls blameless. That's what you get in verse 7. But he says, I'm greater than the temple, and I am the Lord, the Kyrios, over the Sabbath. And that word Lord is the one that's very common. It's used over 700 times in the New Testament, speaking about the one who has power and authority. And he says, I have authority over the Sabbath and what operates in it. Now, for those people that say Jesus never claimed to be God, if you're going to call yourself the Lord over something that is one of the 10 commandments, keeping the Sabbath day holy, and Jesus says, I govern that? Oh my God. Wrap your mind around that. And so what we don't get in Matthew's description of this is their reaction, but we know what it would have been. So Matthew just moves on to the next episode, and it's basically a similar problem. It's once again a matter of something that took place on the Sabbath. So what we're looking at here runs through verse 13. So verse 9 to 13 is this. Now, when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him? That was a reason for the question. It's not because we want to know. We're trying to find another way in to mess you over. Now, let me give you a homework assignment, if you will. Take a look at the idea of Sabbath and what it was intended for. It was where man could cease, have rest from his labor. It's his day off, if you will. It's that time to focus on all the other things that have nothing to do with earning a living, doing the things that you would do, your normal day-to-day routine of things. This is when you say, all of that comes to a stop, and I have time to spend with the Lord. Read chapter 4 of the book of Hebrews, and you'll find it starts in chapter 2, but reading verse 4, you'll see it's kind of the upshot of it. But that Jesus is the representation of that rest. Everything that the Sabbath was supposed to do in the here and now for the body, and it was supposed to focus the mind as well, to the believer, Jesus is the rest that we enter into in the spiritual sense. We don't labor for salvation. It's been offered to us. And so coming to him and trusting him for eternity and for salvation puts us in a place of rest. We don't labor for something that couldn't be labored for anyway. So the believer, if they genuinely understand what's been offered to them, then they would be able to say, I rest in the completed, finished work of Jesus. And he is the physical representation of that rest. I rest in him, which is an interesting argument against those who somehow think that you're supposed to earn your way to heaven or something that you have to do. Well, if you've got to do something in order to be saved, there's no rest in that, because that means for your entire life, you're trying to, by merit, add to the things that Jesus has done, thereby securing your eternity. It's crazy, but people do it. Nonetheless, they are driven to do it. So here's what they do. They ask him what is a question that is going to trip him up, or so they think. Once again, it's on the Sabbath. Let's get him to do something that would be a violation of the law. As they see it, it's a tradition of theirs. Again, reading all of their pages and pages and pages, chapters in the writings of the Talmud of the things you could and could not do on the Sabbath according to their traditions, adding on to what they believe the law was saying, but because it didn't say it expressly, to them it's implied. And because it's implied, somebody needs to interpret that implication and then make it happen. That's the nonsense that you found in the Talmud. And oddly enough, there are so many people who live according to the dictates of the Talmud rather than the scriptures. It's really kind of sad. So here's what they say. Now, let's do this. Let's take a look at, let's go to Mark chapter 3. Let's do this. I want to read what's in the other two Gospels on this, because they're pretty interesting. And they really do tell it the same situation. The big parts of this is the same, but the discussion and the back and forth, the exchange looks very different. So Mark chapter 3, let's read the passage in Matthew in its entirety, and we'll go back to it. We read this in verse 9. When he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him? And then Jesus said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is this man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So he's just answered their question by saying, hey, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, and let me tell you, I'll give you a straight answer to your question. But that answer to the question is going to be that if that was it, it is lawful, it is okay that I do this. Well, but then he actually does it. And so for the people that would be his accusers, Jesus, again, it'd be what's the more impressive thing? To say that it's okay to heal on the Sabbath or to do it on command? Well, if you're able to do it on command, none of those guys could do it. So who's going to have more authority? The guys pushing their tradition or the man who says it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath and I'm going to heal him? And he does. So, boy, oh boy. Now, verse 13. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Now, Mark, in chapter 3, it reads like this. So he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand, and so they watched him closely whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, and so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. Now here you don't get the exchange that he had with the Pharisees. Instead, what you get is just this. Now, so this again, like all of them, when we do this and we compare the other Gospels, that wherever else this might be covered, read them all together and add the individual bits that you might find that's additional, and you'll find that it's always complementary. So it just adds detail to the exact same account. You don't find conflicting information here. So it says, then he said to them. Now he turns his attention to those guys and he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? So he has this part here goes in addition to what he says about would you take care of your sheep if it fell into the ditch? So adding this into that dialogue. So again, it doesn't change anything about what actually happened. They wanted to trip him up. There was a man with a withered hand. Jesus is going to heal him. That they all agree on. It's the dialogue between different people that is the issue here, but you add them all together and they are not in any way contradictory. They just complement. Now, it says, they all kept silent, and when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by their hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Now, you can read these other versions and read what comes after, and you can see the reaction of it. But again, for time's sake, we're not going to read more than just what we have here. Now, let's go to Luke chapter 6. That's the other place where this is discussed. Luke 6. And it starts in verse 6. Now, compare this with the other two that we've just read, and you get this. Now, it happened on the other Sabbath, on another Sabbath also, that he entered the synagogue and he taught. Now, Luke adds that. It was on a different Sabbath, and so it was a time when he was also teaching in that synagogue. So Luke adds that little bit too. Really cool. The synagogue, and he taught, and a man was there whose right hand had was withered. So the scribes and the Pharisees watched him closely. Now here we see that the scribes are mentioned, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts. That's added to by Luke. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. And then Jesus said to him, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them, he said to the man. Now that's, again, the description of this is really, really cool. So in this sequence, the way that it's laid out, really it's kind of in agreement with Mark. He knows what's going on. Sees the man with a withered hand. He knows this is going to be an issue. It's on the Sabbath. He's already taught. He looks at the man. He says, I want you to stand over here. So come to me. The man stands in front of him. And then he looks around and he asks the question, is it lawful for me to heal? Is it lawful for me to do good or to do evil? What is it? So this is done as a teachable moment, but it's a teachable moment that has an answer, and then it's backed up by a miracle. So for him to say, in addition to what we see in Matthew about I'm the Lord of the
the temple. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. That's already been said in a different location, but that's out there. So the people who hate him, the people who are always trying to trip him up, they already know what he has said. I am the master, the Lord over the Sabbath. Man, so here he is on a completely different day, but he's teaching in the synagogue, and a man with a withered hand, and now he looks around and he asks them the question. Now they're all accountable. So he's teaching, but this teaching will follow with a miracle. So he says, when he had looked around at them, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage, and they discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Isn't that an amazing thing? Rather than rejoicing at the fact that a man who had, who knows, this could have affected his livelihood. It's obviously something that he doesn't have use of one of his hands. And to see this, this would be like going to church one day and finding a person who has been disfigured for whatever reason or whatever happened to him, and watching him be healed on the spot and made whole right in front of you. The idea that because of some tradition, you're going to hate the person who did this miraculous thing and not rejoice in the man who had been healed. Would they want to undo it? This would have been a great question. So Jesus could have said, well, would you rather that I undo what I just did? Would have been an interesting discussion, wouldn't it? Let's go back to Matthew and we'll complete this. We may be ending a little bit early here, mainly because I want to save what happens next, and the next thing that Matthew focuses on. It's a very, very important part because Gentiles are mentioned, and it really kind of goes along with that thing that we've been doing, looking at the gospel, quote unquote. What is it and how is it defined? Now, we look at all what's taken place here. Is it lawful? Matthew gives this account starting with the question that was asked by the Pharisees. And so the back and forth, when they ask the question, Jesus answers them with the question. Is it lawful? He looks back at them after he's called the man. He repeats their question back to them when you look at what Mark and Luke have to say. So, verse 10, behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, and they asked Jesus, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him? And then he said to them, and this is the part that Matthew adds, it's unique to his, but when you read the other ones, what has happened is the sequence of events. It's on the Sabbath, he's already healed. The guy with the withered hand, everybody's paying attention to him. That apparently there's some reason why everybody's attention was drawn. Now they're basically saying, are you going to heal him? Is it lawful for you to do that? And then Jesus at that point would have said to the man, come to me. And he steps forward, and then he looks back at him. Is it? You're asking me, is it lawful? And I'm going to give you a demonstration that not only is it lawful, but the Lord of the Sabbath is going to do it right here in this synagogue after teaching you people, and you won't know what to do. You're going to be so overwhelmed by your hatred of me that you're going to do the most insane thing. And that is that you're going to look for some way to destroy me rather than just go, again, this is one of those things it's so hard for me to wrap my mind around. How can you be so filled with hatred that you can't bring yourself to go, he's able to do things no one's ever done before? Maybe we ought to just step back for a second and ask some questions of ourselves. Are we reading this incorrectly? It's kind of like what I remember with Gamaliel in chapter 5 of the book of Acts, is that he finally stood up to the rest of the guys and said, there's been these guys before, Judas and Justus, I believe the two guys that were mentioned, but Judas for sure. But there's a couple of guys, and they brought a whole bunch of people to their side, and they had led these kind of things, and people were really following, but where are they now? They're dead and gone. Nobody pays attention to them. We don't even know who they are. To us, they're lost to history. But Gamaliel basically says, but if this is a work of God, first of all, if this is not a work of God, it's going to be like those other guys that made themselves out to be something. But if this is a work of God, and he's seen these things happen, he knows what's been going on. Jesus has come and gone from the scene. He's died and resurrected, and now these guys are doing miraculous things. He said, but if this is a work of God, there's nothing you can do to stand in opposition to it. You'll be consumed by this all. So that's where we are kind of in the same kind of a situation. They don't have the awareness and the kind of the sharpness of mind to just go, we're seeing stuff that's never been seen before. Maybe we ought to take a second look at this and not be so hasty. But instead, so he asks the question. This is, again, for accountability's sake. It's more than just asking a question of saying, is it lawful? Here, Jesus says, you know for a fact, because I'm sure that there are guys who had done something like this during the Sabbath that's like, yeah, I violated it too. They're trying to find some little nuanced reason why he's violating the law. And his point is, there's stuff that you guys have done that's way beyond anything that you're trying to accuse me or my disciples of doing. So he asks them the question. And it's basically, if you say I would just let the sheep die, you're a liar. That's the implication here. So he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Who among you would do that? And so the obvious answer is none of us. And have any of them done something similar to this? I'm sure that they had. So he asked the question. But let me ask you this, guys. Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? This man with the withered hand. You would have compassion on the sheep if the poor thing's stuck in a pit. Now, not only that, it's going to cost you because you're going to lose that animal, but that animal's going to suffer that way. How about a suffering human being that Jesus would die for, that God loves and created? Who's more valuable here? So he says, who's more valuable, the man or the sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So Jesus gives an answer to the question, and then he performs a miracle, which, again, at this point, the people who are standing against him, the scribes and the Pharisees, they're kind of a lost cause for the most part. I mean, sure, some of them could have turned, obviously. But his point is, you guys have your minds made up. I'm not here to try to convince you, but it's a testimony against you. First of all, I know what you would do given the same circumstance if it was one of your sheep. Secondly, he's going to say to everybody else, you've heard what I said to those guys. Now let me give you a demonstration that I am indeed the Lord of the Sabbath. There's one greater than the temple among you. He's saying all these things that puts him above everything of their religious observance. And now he's talking to the religious people who pride themselves on such knowledge. And Jesus says, let me correct what you think is your knowledge, and then I'll do something that you guys can't do. I'll heal at will, and I'll do it on the Sabbath. Hugely important that he does this. So he says to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Now we read in verse 14, then the Pharisees went out and they plotted against him how they might destroy him. And this will be something that will be following him around for the rest of his earthly ministry, as these people, the religious ones, wanted him dead. And we will find that whether it's in this gospel or the other three, when you take all the individual times when circumstances happened and events took place that he did things that made them really furious and angry, he didn't apologize for it. He just did things that they did. They put him back. These things put those people back on their heels, and it was a testimony against them, and it was a demonstration that Jesus is unique in all of human history. So again, it's the same with us today. I hope that we understand this. When it comes to the things that we say, and how we witness and how we conduct ourselves, the things that we say and how we, do all those kind of things, sometimes the very same people that we're talking with that are adversaries to us, that are wanting to argue things out, again, if it's just me and them in a room, I probably won't have as much to say to a person that just absolutely will never agree with me on something and it's just nothing but adversarial. If it's just me and that person in a room, it's not going to last very long. But I will go round and round with a person like that, more so than many will do, because I know other people are listening or reading. Sometimes this is done through media. I'll take a little bit of extra time with that person, not because I think I'm going to convince them. Their minds are made up. But other people are reading that stuff. Or if it's in a verbal sense, I'll have that discussion with a person if there are others around, because first of all, I want the others who are maybe undecided to hear a credible reason why I differ with that person. Also, how would they encounter something like that? Maybe I can say something that they would think, well, if I'm ever faced with that, that's the tack that I want to take too. So it's an interesting thing. Yeah, you'll take the time to do it if you think that there is somehow fruit to it, but it's beyond the people that you're having your back and forth with.
If you're just convinced there's no way I'm going to ever change this person's mind, if it's just me and them, I'll just say as much as I have to in order to make it something where you've heard my side of it. You're accountable for what I'm saying to you. I know what you think, and I'm accountable for what you said too. But there's no sense in going round and round on this. But if there are other people there, there's bystanders, and we know that this was the case with Jesus. So often he's talking to the people who are there beyond just the ones who are contending with him. Think about what took place of the people who were there listening to all of this. Whose authority do they trust? The people who are always telling them what they can and cannot do based on tradition and additions to what's in the text, or the one who says, you guys are wrong through your traditions and I'm going to heal this man, or I'm going to do something in such a way that's well beyond your power and your authority? Who are you going to trust? Who would you tend to listen to at that point? So once again, we see, and the Gospels agree on this, this is one of those, I think, kind of a pivotal point. He had his detractors. Now they're plotting. They're scheming something together. How do we get rid of him? Now, there will be a number of times when they will plot to either have him arrested or killed, and he eludes them. Now, we're going to see that this is one of those times. He doesn't leave them in fear, but it's becoming something where it's attracting the kind of attention that he's not wanting to attract. He's still wanting to do this work among the disciples and the people who genuinely wanted to hear. So he kind of moves his way out of it, and it's a fulfillment of a prophecy found in Isaiah. So we'll get to that next week. That starts at verse 15. Verse 14 kind of belongs a little bit more with the fallout of what took place, but you'll notice in verse 15, but when Jesus knew this, that they were plotting, then he withdrew from there. And so we'll see what happens as he withdrew, and what Matthew's commentary is on that. It's pretty fascinating stuff. So when it comes to us and this matter of compromise, I think that this is a topic that really needs to be considered as far as the church is concerned. And I'll be honest with you, it's an easy thing when we think of compromise. And I'm not thinking compromise as much in the sense of things that we do in our own private lives and everything else, but compromise in the spiritual sense is an issue. And that's what I'm directed at now. Now, let me stop for a second. Just because there's no one around doesn't mean that we should be a different person when nobody's watching. That's not what I would be saying. I totally disagree with that. I think that the way that you live in your private life is the way you should live elsewhere. So again, you can find all kinds of examples of this where one person will say one thing, but then you're finding out that, well, they're a different person when nobody's watching. So that's all character stuff, and that has its place, but that's not what I'm thinking about here. Because ultimately what I'm thinking of is what leads to that kind of compromise when nobody's watching is really more of a spiritual problem. And that's because you're willing to compromise those things that are the way that God would want them to be. So when it comes to Solomon, he's a case study in this. Now, again, I had mentioned in Ecclesiastes when we were in that book and pointing that out. There's an interesting thing that happens in the book of Ecclesiastes because I believe it's written at the latter part of his life, and I believe that the pursuit of the things that he talks about there had been going on for a long period of time, years and years and years of him trying to do what he talks about in Ecclesiastes, which is, what is new? What is there that's under the sun? How has anything changed? There's a real futility to his reasoning at the end of it. And the only way that you can come to that conclusion is he's really looked into it all. He's done everything that he can to say, why does man toil? Why does man trouble himself? Why does he do this? Why does he do that? What is the answer to these things? And he just can never find a satisfactory answer. So the beginning of Ecclesiastes is really written from a person who has kind of lived at a point in his life where there seems to be such a futility to it. And if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, you see exactly that. There's a real futility and there's a frustration in that man. And it's detectable just in reading what he has to say. But it didn't start out like that. So Remember, he comes into being a king through a great deal of intrigue. His brother has already tried to exalt himself to the place of being king, and he has his supporters. And so there's a rivalry going on there. But David puts his support behind Solomon. And then it becomes an issue where that brother who tried to make himself king comes to try to be humble before Solomon and makes some missteps, and his brother's put to death. So he begins doing some things and making some changes, and so far so good, doing really, really well. Then there comes this point in 1 Kings, in chapter 2. We read in chapter read all of chapter 2, and you'll get an idea that we're getting to the end of David's life. And Solomon is making some good decisions. He's doing what he ought to be doing, but again, think about being him. And so he's only the third in the succession of kings. There's Saul, which nobody would really want to be like him. And there's the complete contrast to him in his father David. David was a much different man than Saul, and people still regard him as the man that really exemplifies the king of Israel. And there are some other kings. Josiah is one that I always point to, and I just think, man, when it comes to being exemplary, you got to look long and hard to find somebody that's better than Josiah was. But David gets all of the publicity, which is fine. God did just incredible things through him, no question about it. And here along comes Solomon, who really kind of came in with some intrigue, and there was a bit of a rivalry there, and it was very, very, it could have been a formidable challenge to the throne. And so God puts that down, and that's what we get all through chapter 2. Now we get to chapter 3. And we read the place where he immediately puts himself in a place of compromise. Though he may not have seen it as compromise, it would have been seen absolutely as compromise for two reasons. You're not supposed to be engaging with pagans and hitching your wagons to them. That's one of the things that they've done. And they're not to be making treaties, and they're not to be making alliances with ungodly nations. So that was something that the law prohibited them from doing. So before we read the really cool thing that he does, there's already compromise. And that's found in the first couple of verses of chapter 3. Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. And then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. So here's the problem. He makes a treaty of some sort, doesn't tell us a whole lot about it, but he makes an alliance, a treaty with Egypt, not something they were ever allowed to do according to the law. So before there was David and Solomon, there was Moses and the giving of the law, and God said, I don't want you making treaties with the other nations. Depend upon me, you don't need to depend upon them. I don't want you intermarrying with them because they'll corrupt you. And so here he does both of those things. And there are a number of other things that Solomon does, the collecting of horses and the accumulating of a number of things. He shouldn't have done any of that stuff. He makes some mistakes. However, in verse 4, we read this. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for there was a great high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask, what shall I give you? So God appears to him even after he's made this treaty. Now, I'm sure that there's so much more that could have been said to Solomon through the years, maybe immediately thereafter. We only get little bits and pieces of any particular story, any particular personage that we get in the scriptures. Remember, these are people who lived for years and years and years, and we just get snapshots of little bits of pieces at a time. So it says, and Solomon said, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and uprightness of heart with you. You have continued to this day great kindness, or you have continued this great kindness for him, in that you have given him a son to sit upon the throne as it is to this day, which would have been a fulfillment of Scripture, by the way. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant the king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. By comparison, he speaks. Now, Solomon's not a little child. He's already been given a wife by the king of Pharaoh. So he's not a child
in the sense of chronologically, but by comparison to David, a child. I do not know how to go out or how to come in. That's lead the people. I don't know how to do this. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered. So not only am I a child by comparison to my father, you've put me in charge of your people. Of all things, your people, the ones who can't even be numbered. So who am I that I could be up to this? So he says this, therefore, will you give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? Now, God was pleased with this, but the idea, how can I discern the difference between good and evil? God gives him the ability to do it. Notice what he says. The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked for this thing, not for things plural, for this thing. I don't know how to lead them. Will you give me the ability? That's what he asks for. And God says, so pleased that you asked that. Now, you can ask for something and God can give it to you. It doesn't mean that you will necessarily employ it all the time, and clearly he did not. So he asked for the ability to discern. I want to know the difference between good and bad. And you may know the difference between good and bad and not do it. That's compromise. You know what God wants you to do, and yet you do the opposite or something that is a variation of it, or you just look for a way to blur the lines. Well, here he ran the stop signs is what he did. He ran the red light is what he actually ended up doing. Because look at what it says. Then God said to him, because you have asked for this thing, you have not asked for long life for yourself, nor have you asked for riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is just, justice, doing the right thing. That's what you've asked for. As a result, here's what he says. I have done according to your words. I've given you what you've asked. I have given you a wise and an understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before, nor shall there be any like you after. And I believe that that is of mankind. There has never been someone like Solomon, not just among the children of Israel or for his time. I believe what we're reading here is that there's never going to be anyone like you, nor has there ever been. Of course, save Jesus, or, that, as far as that's concerned, he's in his own world. He's in his own category. But among men, there's not one like you. So, and I have given you what you have not asked for, riches, honor, so that you shall be unlike anyone who is among you of the kings of your days. So, if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Well, so what happens with this compromise? Where do we find that it actually becomes a real serious issue? Let's go forward in this same book to chapter 11. And again, let's reset on this, the idea of compromise. Compromise is that you may have the ability to know absolutely and discern as he has asked for, because let's remember, it's not that he didn't have it. He said, I don't know how to do these things. Will you give me the ability? God says, I'm blessed, I'm happy by what you've asked for, because you didn't ask for what everybody else would ask for. You see who you are, and you recognize that you're not up to the task. So I'll give you what you asked for in measure that you could not possibly understand. So it's not that he didn't have the knowledge. He had the knowledge. Everything was there in front of him. The law had been written. So the things that he's not supposed to do, making alliances with foreign nations, having multiple wives, marrying unbelievers, that kind of a thing, all of that stuff was prohibited by the law. He wasn't a dumb man. He was incredibly wise, unlike anybody else. So he couldn't plead ignorance in this. Actually, he is, at that point, he is least able to plead ignorance than anyone who has ever lived. Think about that. At least I guess you could say, we could say up to the time when Jesus came into this reality, because we know things that he could have only dreamt of. But he does this. Chapter 11, here's where compromise gets to the point where it is destructive to the soul. So it says this, Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and the Hittites. These are people who were not supposed to even be in the country. They were supposed to have been removed and conquered, defeated, and eradicated from the land, and yet he's marrying them. So think about that. That was the dictate that God gave to Joshua. Take them all out. I've judged them. That's basically God saying, I've already made the judgment. I want them gone. Their penalty is destruction. Do it. So that's what he sent them out to do because God had already judged them. Well, by this time, that didn't happen. They've repopulated. And now here is the very king of Israel who knows better, who is in such a horrible state of compromise that he begins to marry all of these foreign women. Look at what ends up happening. From the nations of whom the Lord said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor them with you. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Oh boy. So if you want to know what would take a man from saying, I don't know how to do this, will you give me the ability to discern the difference between good and evil? And God giving him that in measure, but him not doing it. That is what happens with compromise, and compromise, unfortunately, tends to be something that just builds upon itself. It's easy to compromise once. Compromising 10 times is that much easier because you've already done it once and survived it. Well, here at this case, he's gotten to the point of absurdity. This is so ridiculous that he has... If you think that he spent one day with each wife and each concubine, it would take him almost 3 years to get to spend just one day with everything that he had. It is, to say it's insane is beyond, it just does offense to the word insane, basically. But boy, that shows you what happens with compromise. It starts small. He married one wife of a daughter of Pharaoh, and he made a treaty, and it turned into that. So he goes from that place because of compromise of asking for the best possible thing, and God saying, I'm going to give you what you asked for, and everything that you didn't, there will never be anyone else like you. Walk with me. That's what God asks him to do. Well, he starts out well, but he really falls by his own compromise, and it snowballs on him to the point where not only did he marry these people, but he turned his back on what God asked him to do. And that's why you find in Ecclesiastes a broken, frustrated man who has just kind of come to an end of himself. And look at the way he ends that book. What's the summary to this whole matter? Why don't you just do my paraphrase? Do what God says in the beginning. What God said is walk honorably before me as your father David did, and don't turn your back. He did exactly the opposite of that, only to come back at the end of his life in all of the frustration, looking back at all of his failure and all of the folly of compromise and what it brought and the destruction that it brought about. And he says, if I'd only been responsible and done what God had asked me in the first part, that is man's all. We can only be faithful to him and not compromise the things that he's asked us to compromise. So hugely, hugely important topic. Just wanted to kind of share it with you. And again, it was just one of those cool things sitting there on a Sunday morning. I get to do that now, and I didn't get to do it for such a long, long time, of sitting in the sanctuary and just being one of the congregation. We're going through that particular book on Sunday morning, and I read that and thought, this would be a good thing to share on the apologetic side of things, how easy compromise comes in. And there's another one that was from that same Sunday morning that I'll share with you on our next time that we get together. And it is one of the idea of humility versus pride, and it's a pretty fascinating thing. So we'll pick up this coming Monday in the book of Isaiah as we continue through that, and we will continue here in chapter 12 next Thursday, going through the book of Matthew. And I hope that you're able to join us for that.